Welcome to our unit about text, what to do with text. Every figure without any text is just like a piece of abstract art. Text is always critical to relate a chart to our image to our reality. Below here you see two pieces of two colored pieces. One is an abstract art and the other is actually a biological data figure. You cannot tell which one is which unless you know the artist really well. At first glance and without any text, they could both be hanging in the Guggenheim in New York. However, one is a piece of art by Gerhard Richter called 4096 Colors, and the other is biological data that says genes are either switched on or off. It's called a microarray. Without text, you have no idea what's what and you cannot tell. So first of all, the amount of text matters. So here we see two examples from both extremes. This example was voted among the 10 worst charts in the scientific world ever made because it doesn't have any x-axis labels or y-axis labels or in fact any labels whatsoever. On the other hand, this example here I found in a recent paper and I was astonished because the legend space is many times that space of the actual chart. So too little text is never a good idea, and when the legend is larger than the chart, you might have too much text. The next important information is that axis labels are not optional. Take a minute to read this beautiful comic from XKCD on that subject and take home the message that you can really offend people if you do not label your axes correctly. But do pay attention to redundant axis labels. Sometimes our x-axis says day 1, day 2, day 3. In that case, you might consider just labeling it 1, 2, 3 days as the title of the axis. So do pay attention where you have redundant labels that can be moved to the title or to the legend. Abbreviations are very, very rarely clear. In fact, this is a paper that I should at first glance understand because it's from a topic that is very, very close to what I used to be doing as an experimental biologist. However, until this day, I have not been able to find out what the abbreviations really want to be saying because they're not explained in the figure legend. D, MD, PMD, M, PM, and P are not common standard abbreviations that every biologist should know. Similarly, there are very few abbreviations that are so common that you should be using them without explanation in a manuscript or in a figure. If you do use abbreviations, test them beforehand. So you can either do this by testing them with colleagues, find 10 random people in your department and ask them if they know the abbreviation. If not a single one of them can tell you what it actually stands for, do not use it. The alternative is that you Google it. If among the first 10 hits there is no clear indication to what you assume is the correct meaning of that abbreviation, the chances are high that no one in your audience will know. Also, the audience does matter. The figure is rarely made just for you or your lab, but it's made for colleagues from the wider field, maybe for funding agencies, maybe for journalists, politicians, or patients that have something to do with a gene that you're working on biology. Maybe it is for new PhD students. A lot of people are reading your papers that are not familiar yet with your specific subject. Think about them when designing figures and including abbreviations. Number 4 topic is Please avoid text rotations. So now we're not talking about the amount and type of text, but we talk about the text layout. So in this case, you have a vertical bar chart with vertical labels. Each degree that a label is turned around causes your audience to turn their heads, at least mentally as well, which is a bit uncomfortable and not easy to read. So your audience has to, if you have vertical text, you force your audience to mentally turn their heads, which is uncomfortable, and no one likes being uncomfortable. You have two options. One, try to find a possibility to fit the text below each bar in this case. You can do this, for example, by slightly widening the bars themselves, using a slightly smaller font size for the text, or just trying to shorten your text in the first place somehow. I would argue that in 99% of the cases, there will be enough space for horizontal labels in your charts. And if there is really no space at all, try flipping the data. If you do not show this data as a vertical bar chart, but instead a horizontal bar chart, you suddenly create a lot of space for even the longest titles, such as the United States of America. So this was the first point about layouting of text. So do not use text rotation. But the next one is that all alignments make reading faster. So, for example, let's discuss titles. If we have a right-aligned titles, that looks usually really, really weird and looks often cluttery and is not readable. Why? Because our eyes start looking at a visualization exactly the same way as they look at text. They typically start at the left uppermost corner and read down by line, by line, by line. If you put something as critical, which should be seen as the first thing, as the title of a chart, into the right-hand corner, you force the audience to be a bit slower with finding it. So avoid right-aligned titles at all costs. What about the alternatives is a left or a center-aligned titles. They generally look more harmonious. Left-aligned, I already said before, is exactly how we read text. We start in the upper leftmost corner. That's where we first look for any information in any visualizations that we interact with. We look here, we then sort of scroll down with our eyes, and we end up here. So below here is a perfect space, for example, to hide unimportant information such as legend maybe, or the source of the data, or the sample size, and things like this. But here at the left uppermost corner should ideally be your title. Center alignment is a second possibility that some people prefer. And in this case, it sort of works because the chart itself is symmetrically. I'm going to now show you why center alignment is actually sometimes quite difficult. So let's consider this. Most charts that we want to have a title for are not symmetrically. For example, because I have a legend like this guy here. So in this case, finding the visual center of a chart is actually quite hard. So in this case, we have two examples. Both are center aligned. So this center alignment is of the title with the chart area. So it's right in the middle, and it sort of is where maybe you would expect it. This looks strange, because in this case, the alignment was centrally done to the entire space of the chart, including the legend. Okay? So, and if you want to use a center-aligned heading, make sure that you find the visual balance, and it takes a lot of iterations and a lot more feedback. So very, very often, the left alignment is just a lot faster to get right. So now that you know where to place legends and how to not rotate text, let's quickly discuss fonts. So text comes in different styles, and these styles are a font. So I don't have any opinions that of which fonts are great or not great, but you should always find one that is legible for a scientific purpose. What does the legibility depend on? It depends a lot on the X height of a font. The X height is the height of the letters at a given point size. For example, Arial 12 point is larger than Times 12 point. And all the font, and this is shown here. So if you at 51 points, for example, show the different heights of the letters, you can see that by using a Times New Roman font, you will over a whole page probably gain a lot of space and have maybe one line extra, which might be essential for a grant proposals. All fonts that have a variable X height, they do exist. For example, handwriting or Comic Sans MS very quickly look quite cluttery and shouldn't be used. The legibility of a font also depends on the size of the counters. What does that mean? The counter is the white space that is inside one of the letters, for example, a B or a G. And bold is usually harder to read at the same point size than a regular font, simply because the space of counter is less than in a regular font. So remember that that bold text sometimes stands out a little bit more, but if there's a lot of bold text, it's much harder to read than a regular font or a light font. Legibility of a font also depends on the size of ascenders and descenders. Ascenders and descenders basically explain how far does the H, for example, go up above the X height, or how low does the G or the P or the Y go below the X height. So some fonts are a lot larger than this, and this in turn makes the space they require a lot larger at the same point size. Legibility does not depend on serif versus sans serif font times, and there's science supporting this. So what is a sans serif font? Sans serif fonts do not have these little feet that the serif fonts are standing on. So serif is basically the old font that was used in newspapers and printing presses, etc. And the little feet were required to fit the letters into the machines properly and have them fixed in space. Nowadays, we don't use printing machines with individual letters anymore, and actually computers, the very first computers, had poor pixel resolution, so the feet were actually really hard to display. So sans serif fonts were developed and sort of nowadays look a little bit more modern than serif fonts. There was, however, a study investigating this, and it showed that at the same legibility, so same X height and clear counters and not too high ascenders and descenders, it doesn't matter if the font has sans serif or serif. The reading speed largely only depends on what you are used to and what you grew up with. So for a lot of people, from young people from today that grew up with computers that you use sans serif fonts, they will be a bit faster reading sans serif font lettering. So a typical font that is sans serif is Arial, and a typical font that is in a serif format is Times. For the scientific purposes, we can summarize fonts very briefly. If you want to be modern, use Helvetica Neue Ultralight. If you want to be dramatic or epic, use Trajan Pro. And if you want to be sophisticated, use Georgia. And that's all you need to know about typography. And that pretty much is correct. All you should do is to remember to never use the fonts that were voted to be the worst in the universe, which is the font that was designed for the London 2012 Olympics, which had a lot of people very, very upset. Some people even said it looks like a font used by the Nazis. And the other font that is universally agreed on to be really shitty looking is Comic Sans MS. And in fact, right now in this in this PowerPoint slide, it looks okay, which is the reason is it has been updated to look a lot less cluttery than in the very first PowerPoint presentation. So maybe go back to an old version of Office and you will find that the Comic Sans MS font is really quite horrible there. Next, the last point about text is the letter style. You should remember that capitalization and italic letters are usually less easy to read and should be avoided, even on poster titles, etc. So you can quickly have a look at this. I will move myself out of the way. And you can yourself compare how easy it is to read text that is in regular font and text that is all in capital letters. And you will realize that the longer a title goes, the less easier it is to read capital letters. This passage can be read and understood and absorbed far more quickly and effortlessly because your brain recognizes the shapes of the words it learned before it actually reads individual letters. This passage can never be read as fast and understood and absorbed. In particular, if you have to read a few hundred words like this, it can become very tiring and frustrating, etc. So try it out and remember that capitalization does not make it stand out any more than regular text. So to summarize, titles and text do help and should never be forgotten. Be super careful when using abbreviations in your work. Align and avoid text rotation. Align text as much as possible on pages is really critical for the overall look of cleanliness. And then choose standard fonts. They all work fantastically well. And don't experiment in a scientific setting with fonts. And rarely capitalize.